A reading from Esther. When Mordecai learned all that had been done, Mordecai tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes, and went through the city, wailing with a loud and bitter cry. He went up to the entrance of the king's gate, for no one might enter the king's gate clothed with sackcloth. In every province, wherever the king's command and his decree came, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting and weeping and lamenting, and most of them lay in sackcloth and ashes. When Esther's maids and her eunuchs came and told her, the queen was deeply distressed. She sent garments to clothe Mordecai, so that he may take off his sackcloth, but he would not accept them. Then Esther called for Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs, who had been appointed to attend her, and ordered him to go to Mordecai to learn what was happening and why. Hathach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate, and Mordecai told him all that had happened to him, and the exact sum of money that Haman had promised to pay into the king's treasuries for the destruction of the Jews. Mordecai also gave him a copy of the written decree issued in Susa for their destruction, that he might show it to Esther, explain it to her, and charge her to go to the king to make supplication to him and entreat him for her people. Hathach went and told Esther and Mordecai what Haman had said. Then Esther spoke to Hathach and gave him a message from Mordecai, saying, all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law. All alike are to be put to death. Only if the king holds out the golden scepter to someone may that person live. I myself have not been called to come to the king for 30 days. When they told Mordecai what Esther had said, Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, do not think that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silence at such a time as this, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another quarter. But you and your father's family will perish. Who knows? Perhaps you have come to royal dignity for just such a time as this. Then Esther said in reply to Mordecai, go, gather all the Jews to be found in Susa, and hold a fast on my behalf, and neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my maids will also fast as you do. After that I will go to the king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. Mordecai then went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Last week, we heard from the prophet Habakkuk. And one of the things that we heard from the prophet was God saying, you think all this violence and injustice you see your people perpetrating against each other is bad? Just wait till the Babylonians get here. Today, when we catch up with this story of God's people in the book of Esther, the Babylonians have come and gone, having been crushed by the Persians, led by Cyrus the Great. Now, for some, this was a good thing because Cyrus allowed the Jews who had been exiled by the Babylonians to go back to Jerusalem and rebuild if they wanted to. Many did go back, but not all of them. Some of them stayed. Some of them ended up in Persia. Now King Ahasuerus is in charge. There is no King Ahasuerus known in history, but he's usually identified with Xerxes the First, who I'm sure you're thinking, oh right, Xerxes the Great. Yeah. That name, Xerxes, great name, right? Why don't we use that more often? That name means ruling over heroes. He may have thought highly of himself, I'm not sure. Oh, and he just happens to be Cyrus's grandson. So this is 2 generations later. In contrast to Xerxes, ruler over heroes, we have Esther. Esther is female and Jewish and an orphan. She is a nobody among nobodies in a minority community in the center of the Persian Empire, which at the time was the largest empire yet. Esther represents the Jewish people in many ways. She was orphaned, taken in by her uncle Mordecai, but then taken off to be part of the king's harem. The Jews in Persia had first been uprooted from Jerusalem and taken to Babylon, their original time of being orphaned. And then when they had finally started setting down roots to find ways to practice their faith again, some of them were hauled off a second time to the Persian capital, Susa. Now, just like Esther represents the people of Judea, her uncle Mordecai represents the Jewish tradition. He is the one who takes Esther in after she's orphaned. That represents the way that the Jews were able to return to some of their religious traditions after they were in Babylon. But then again, in Persia, they were separated from their traditions in most ways. Now, Esther has another name, a more Jewish name that it was thought better she not use. That name was Hadassah. In Hebrew, it means myrtle. Myrtle is one of 4 fruits, along with citron, palm, and willow that were used in the Feast of Tabernacles, each fruit representing a combination of learning and good works that somehow related to the fruit's fragrance and taste. I'm not going to pretend to understand how they made these connections, but in this case, myrtle has a pleasing fragrance but a bitter taste, and that represented good works but a lack of learning. So in this sense, Esther represented the reality that the Jewish people in Persia lacked learning in terms of their religious traditions, but she also represented the hope that they could still do good works, that they could still choose the right thing. So that's the important background, the context in which Esther faces her own personal dilemma that is the focus of this story, this book of Esther. And I'm going to skip all the soap opera-esque twists and turns. If you're interested, it's a short book and well worth the read. But I'm going to give you just the really basic situation here. Esther has recently been chosen as the, or more likely a, new queen of Persia. But someone has convinced the king of Persia to decree that all Jews will be put to death. That includes Mordecai, Esther's uncle who raised her, and presumably it includes Esther, though at this point the king does not know that Esther is Jewish. So Esther's uncle Mordecai wants Esther to use her position as queen to go to the king and try to get the decree changed. The only leverage he sees. But Esther is afraid to do this, and with good reason, right? As she put it, all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law. All alike are to be put to death. Now, lest you think, well, obviously any king would let his queen approach and not kill her. After all, he chose her to be queen. I want to make sure you're also aware of the fact that the reason there was an opening for a new queen in the first place is because the previous queen, Vashti, had been banished for refusing to come when the king called for her. Things worked a little differently back then in Persia, and it is doubtful that romance had anything to do with Esther's selection as queen. Esther herself points out, it's been 30 days since the last time Esther has been called to see the king. It's been a month since the last time she had any contact with him. So it's at this point of tension between the Jewish people seeming to face certain death and the possibility of Queen Esther facing death in order to attempt to save her people. Into that tension, Mordecai delivers the most famous line in this book. Perhaps you have come to royal dignity for just such a time as this. It's a great line, right? I mean, why try to deny that? And it's the same idea that lives on in many ways today, right? That famous phrase that became Spider-Man's popular mantra, with great power comes great responsibility. Right? The theme common to our hero stories, the idea that when someone is given an extraordinary gift, they should do something extraordinary with it. But there's a better line in this theme. After Esther's initial response is negative, part of Mordecai's response is, for if you keep silence at such a time as this, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another corner. Some people don't exactly like the book of Esther because God doesn't show up in this book in obvious ways. God isn't even mentioned by name in this book. But God's activity is certainly implied in Mordecai's statement of faith, isn't it? I mean, if Esther isn't the means of salvation for the Jews at this time, God will find another way. That's what Mordecai believes. And isn't that what we've been hearing all fall? God has made promises to these people, to the descendants of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, right? And God will see to it that those promises are fulfilled. God has done so again and again and again and again, and God will do so with or without Esther. God will find a way. Still, who knows? Perhaps you have come to royal dignity for such a time as this. Perhaps. But this is Advent, so we don't really know. What we have right now are the promises. Right? Just like Mordecai, who stated those promises in his own way. Promise that salvation will come. Somehow. God promised. It's still dark, but we know the dawn is coming. And we've all been through those times. We've wondered, how are we going to get by? How are we going to make it through this? We've wondered, how are we going to face tomorrow? Wondered, how in the world is God going to redeem this mess that we're in? Some of us have been amazed by what God has done. Others of us are still waiting. It sure helps to have a Mordecai around, doesn't it? To have someone who sees with eyes of faith better than we do. Someone who can remind us that God is always faithful. And remind us in ways that we're able to hear that. Especially, oh my goodness, when that person is willing to sit vigil with us, to wait with us. Whether it's sitting with us in our living room, sitting next to us in a hospital waiting room, or whether it's through messages sent from miles and miles away. Mordecai, our tradition, is intended for that purpose, to remind us who we are, to remind us what God has promised, to remind us that God is always faithful. And since God is faithful, who knows? What is sure is that salvation will come somehow. What we don't necessarily know is if or how we will be part of God's plan. Who knows? Perhaps you have come to royal dignity for just such a time as this. Now, maybe you notice that Mordecai doesn't tell Esther what to do in this story. And he does not make promises over things that he has no control over. Mordecai doesn't know if Queen Esther will survive approaching the king uninvited. And he doesn't give her any false hope that that will work. What he does know is that if she doesn't try, that she will perish along with him and the rest of the Jews. But he also knows that God has promised the Jewish people will survive somehow. Not necessarily that that somehow includes Esther, but somehow. But who knows? Maybe it will be through Esther. Mordecai doesn't tell Esther what to do. He doesn't tell her what will happen. But Mordecai does invite Esther to consider her part in God's larger plan. Esther is invited to affirm that God is indeed good and God is indeed faithful, and then she's invited to play a part in making God's kingdom a reality here on earth. Esther, the orphan. Esther, the Jewish girl. The foreigner. The minority. The new queen. Esther, the uninvited guest. And that's where our text leaves us today. With Mordecai's statement of faith, with Mordecai's invitation to consider being part of what God is doing, and then not knowing how it turns out for Esther. Because this is Advent. Because we're in the middle of all sorts of things. Because darkness is part of this world. All the time. Because we're all waiting for something. Trying to find that faith Mordecai has and proclaim our own trust in God's faithfulness and goodness despite so much evidence to the contrary. Because despite believing that God is good and God is faithful, we don't know how that reality will show up in our lives and the lives of those around us. Not yet. But who knows? We've been invited to consider our circumstances and what part we could play in God's ongoing work of redemption in our world. We've been invited to affirm God's goodness, to confirm our willingness to be part of God's plan, to be counted on God's side. We've been invited to use whatever gifts and resources we have at our disposal to do what is right, even if we don't feel like we know enough to really discern what is right. We've been invited to act out of faith and see what happens. Until we do, we wait.